You know, one of my pet peeves is in the beginning of a tutorial, the guy will always be like, you know what, this is going to be an exciting tutorial. They always use that word exciting, and sometimes the tutorial is just not going to be exciting. Sometimes it's just going to be a particle system locked onto a tracker like this one, which does in fact look cooler when you look at it from the camera view. It looks like it's coming off the finger, but in reality, there's nothing too crazy about this. Yes, this goes through all the kind of like workspaces of Blender. You're going to learn about tracking, particles, shading, compositing, but that's not cool. That's pretty lame. So let this be let this be a boring tutorial, and yeah, let me show you how to put things on fingers, I guess. New Blender project. Before we start anything, you're going to need to film yourself filming something with your finger. Film yourself filming something with a finger. That makes sense. Either do this with like a Sharpie dot or whatever. I just did this, so tracking would be easier. Or, by the way, if you're a Patreon, this is going to be available on the Patreon, this footage, but you may as well just film something yourself so it looks cool, okay? Once you have your footage, we're going to start with a new Blender file, and the first task of this whole particle, shading, compositing, kind of whatever, of course, is going to be tracking, because we need to know where the finger is going to be. To do this, we are going to go to the movie clip editor. Normally, I advocate for like converting into an image sequence before that, but today we're going to be fucking crazy, okay? We're going to be off the walls. All the rules are going to be broken, okay? Don't tell your parents that you're watching this one. This one's going to be off the chain. We're going to import in our footage. So here we go, footage imported. And before we begin tracking, by the way, if you don't know, this is the tracking workspace. We'll talk about it before we do anything. Hit set scene frames, so we know we're going from frame 1 to, I guess, 267. Automates that process. And second of all, hit prefetch, so this footage goes into memory, which usually does take a second or two. You just want to wait for this bar to be purple. Okay, perfect. We have our footage in here. Couple things to consider. Our footage is, I guess, 29.97 frames per second. For you, that could be different, but just update your frame rate. And also, this is kind of like a tiny little detail. Color management, make sure this is set to standard. You can see it kind of changes the color space into what the footage originally looked like. Okay, forget about it. How do we do our tracking in the easiest way possible? Well, first of all, these are your tracker settings. We're going to enable normalize, so whatever tracker we add isn't that, it doesn't really care about lighting changes, right? It normalizes that, so that's going to be something it's not sensitive to. And now that we have all our tracker settings, I guess all I wanted is normalize. Once we have that, we are just going to go to the first frame where we want to begin tracking. So I guess that's not going to be frame 1 because the finger comes on at like frame 40 or something. Let's say we start on frame 43 or whatever. What you want to do, control click right here, scale it up. So this is going to be the area that it's tracking. Of course, you want it to be your dot, and then Alt S. For the search window, some of you guys probably already know this. This is where it's going to search for that tracker. To begin tracking, you either Alt right arrow or even faster Control T, and let's see if it makes it all the way through. Seems to have made it pretty much all the way through. I was expecting it to do a bit of a hiccup and I show you the correction, but that's just what happens when you make a perfect dot. If at any point it like veers off course, just move it back and then continue tracking. But it keeps tracking until frame like 200 something, 221, because then it kind of starts going off frame and the motion blur is intense, but that's fine. Control L to lock the tracker. This is where we're going to end it. So again, we made a tracker, Control L to lock it, and now we have a nice little tracker. Question is, how do we take this X and Y data, put it in our 3D viewport, and then, make a particle system, etc.? Well, first step for that is to actually see the 3D viewport. You can see that we have a cube. We don't need it. A light we can keep for now. And the camera is, it just exists. To take this tracker, or I guess this tracker information, and map it into the 3D viewport, the common trick, actually the only trick, is hitting reconstruction and link empty to track. This makes an empty that is parented to the camera, so you can see it's dependent on the position of this, that moves with our finger, okay? And this will be more obvious in a second. So again, once you've done this, let's make our camera position more nicely. I'm going to center it in terms of rotation and location, and then just bring it up. Again, doesn't really matter how you do this because the empty is parented, or it's relative to our camera. The reason I did it like this is so that our empty is now on the ground plane, which is pretty nice, okay? So you can see, you can see from the perspective of this footage, nothing happens until we get to frame 43, where we begin tracking, etc. If we want to see what is going on here, easy trick, camera properties, background images. This is just to load in the background. What we're going to do, not viewport display, background images. We are going to import in our footage. Might even already be here. Nope. Guess we got to import it in manually like some kind of caveman. We've discovered fire but can't even get the footage here. Whatever. You're going to see By the way, this is not updating. Make sure this has more frames so it actually cycles through all those. You're going to see in a second, now it's going to stick on to the finger. Perfect. So we have a camera, we have a tracker, we have footage, we pretty much have the whole shebang. Let's make that a bit brighter. And now let's make our particle system. Super easy. To do this, what we are going to do is you can't really take your empty and make a particle system off of that, sadly. Also, another thing you can't do is proceed without saving. So let's actually save this. I'm going to call it I have a Patreon. There we go. So a name that we can all remember and gain some value from. Notice that we cannot add a particle system to an empty. So what we need to do is kind of add a proxy or intermediate object to make the particle system. That's going to move with the empty, okay? Frame 43, what we're going to do is Shift S. This is to move the 3D cursor. So I'm going to do cursor to selected. So now the 3D cursor is now on the empty. Shift A. I'm going to add in, I guess, anything. I guess a sphere probably makes sense. And again, the reason I did that Shift S trick is now it's I guess I don't even know why. Now it's added exactly to the position of the 3D cursor, which happens to be the position of the empty, right? If we had the cursor in the world origin, and then we tried adding a object again, it's now going to be centered over here, okay? That's why we did it. If we click play, nothing happens because, you know, we just made a sphere. Doesn't parent to anything. So take your sphere, shift click, make sure you're holding shift, drag onto the tracker, okay? The reason we do that is so it's kind of nested in here and parented, okay? So now our sphere moves with this. Beautiful. In the 3D viewport, again, what's happening is we just have this thing moving. By the way, if you're curious, why is this on the ground plane? Long story short, this tracker doesn't have any animation or keyframes or, you know, graph editor curves to it. The motion is actually driven by this constrained follow track, and you can pick stuff like the depth object, etc. Just a quick little thing for the advanced users. We can make a plane even higher. And for this tracker, we could say project from the camera down to the depth of the plane. So now it's the same kind of setup. It will look the same from here. If we hide the plane, it will look the same, but now it's just closer. That's just a thing you can do. Make sure that's removed. Okay, back on course. Okay, the ship has been steering away. How do we add in a particle system? Okay, to add in our particle system, we just select the proxy object, again, the one tracked to, or I guess parented to the tracker. We're going to go to the particle system. We're going to add a particle system, and already, well, I guess it's going to start emitting early, but already kind of does exactly what we want it to because all the motion gives us the nice velocity stuff. And you can see particles kind of get smaller, which is actually them falling away. You know, they get further and further away from the camera, which looks like they're drifting into the abyss, but whatever. So there you go, particle system. We want to have it start on frame 43. Why? Because the finger doesn't start moving until then. Frame start, move it to 43. So now we're going to have nothing until 43. It's going to start emitting. And then I think it was 222 or 221 is where we're going to have it stop emitting. Let's make sure that's correct. Yeah, I think 221 seems just about right. Okay. So it's going to emit until 221, and then it's going to stop emitting. And we could control a whole bunch of properties about this, like, you know, the number of particles and stuff like that. But before we get into that, kind of like technical small details, I want to talk about kind of like bigger theory. First of all, if we were to go to the render tab, this is what we're supposed to see when we render, and we hit F12. You're going to notice that nothing is rendered except for the, you know, the emitter, right? The particles are in the viewport, but they're not real in some sense. So let's take care of that. To do that, go to the render tab. In other words, what are our particles going to look like on render? We're going to say for each particle, render a object. Which object is that going to be? We want each one to be a sphere or a cube or I guess whatever you want it to be. So we can just pick one. By the way, for some reason, you can't pick the emitter to also be the instance object in my experience, which is pretty lame. So we're just going to add in a second sphere, tuck it away. And now if we set our particle system for the object to be the second sphere, you're going to see it's working. And also a little extra detail, it actually has shading. You can see there's actual shadows here. And that's because of the position of our light. We can move our light around and get different kinds of shadows, as you can see. But really, because it's instancing this object, which has a BSDF, that material is carried over to each one of these. Couple other small details to make this look cool is in the, what am I looking for? Render, add a bit of scale variation. So some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. Who knows what we're going to get? Also, another thing, let's make it twice the number of particles. So it's still emitting from 43 to 221, but now it's doing it at an average rate of ×2. Another thing we can do is if you want to change the physics of it, again, the drifting off is a property of gravity. If you don't want that, by the way, which we do. But if you don't want that, you can go to, I think, force field settings. No, it's the one that sounds like it. Field weights. You'd think it'd be force field because gravity is a force, but no. Field weights take the gravity down to 0. And then when we simulate again, things should just be drifting, right? So not everything's falling. And that just kind of gives a different, more scattered look. I don't like the look of that, okay? But to make this look a bit more chaotic, we can add in a different field, not gravity, but turbulence. We can make that turbulence a bit stronger if we go over here, twice the strength, and you can see, if you remember what it looked like before, now there's just a bit more chaos going on. Just so you can see what it looks like if we bump it up like times 10 to 20, it really adds in a lot of chaos. So this just kind of gives it a stylistic effect. Maybe we do want it higher. I think for my original render, I had it set to 2. I'm going to keep it at 10 or something like that, just because it has a bit more dynamic kind of oomph to it, which is always cool. Okay, so I think we have the physics down to bake down the physics so that we don't have to recalculate it every time we render and stuff like that. Just go to cache, go to bake, and then we, bake it. So now we don't need to calculate, right? The calculation's already stored inside the blend file as a cache that is, I guess, 2.8 megabytes. Remember when video games were 2.8 megabytes? Me neither. I'm not like a fucking boomer. But I'm sure some of you probably remember. I appreciate the older audience members. I think it's cool. Okay, cool. So now we have the physics. One thing we're going to notice is now when we render, a couple things. One, we have the particles. But 2, there's a background that we don't want. And 3, you probably can't see it, but the emitter is still here. Like if we render like a frame before the particles, boom, you see we have the emitter. Let's tackle all of those things, not necessarily in the order I talked about them. And first of all, to get rid of the emitter in render, again, what is being shown when we hit render, right? So, we already talked about this. Disable show emitter. So now when we render, it's not going to show it, but it will still show particles at a later frame. Cool. And second of all, we talked about the background. So render tab, film, where's film? Transparent. This is going to make it so that the background is just, alpha equals 0. So it's, transparent, not opaque. And third of all, we want the background to be, in the background. In other words, the movie clip to be in the background. This is where compositing comes into play. Use nodes. Long story short, if you don't know compositing, probably not the tutorial for you, but just kind of quick rundown. Render layers is going to be everything in the 3D viewport. In other words, our particles. Just think of this node as particles. We want to add in the movie clip. The movie clip, which one? Footage. So this is exactly on the same frame, the finger moving. We want to overlay one on top of the other. This can be done with alpha overnode, which, by the way, shortcut, you select both of these, Control-Alt-0. Look at that. You're not going to learn that in Ducky 3D tutorials. Not at all. Alpha overnode. Or you could just type it in, right? Make sure that, by the way, the footage is in the background, so it should be on the top node. That's just convention, and then you can see everything is overlaid properly. So whatever frame we go to, again, the compositor will only update the footage, right? So the footage is being updated very slowly, but every time we move the frame, it is being updated. Render isn't, because for render layers node, or again, particle node to be updated, F12, just to re-render. And now, the particles are coming off in the right direction. Okay, cool. So that's kind of like the main effect. We could just like render the whole sequence and it would be fine. But there's not much stylization. It doesn't look good is what I'm trying to say going on. So the question is, how do we color it and make it brighter depending on how old the particle is and have them dwindle out and go out of focus, etc. It's a lot of things. I guess we should start with the color. To do that, shading workspace, again, the way you want to think about this is, let's go to render tab. The particle system is a bunch of points. It's just a bunch of 3D XYZ points, where for each one of those, we are taking this instance object, this sphere, we can call it particle, and we're wow, that is a word right there, instancing it on every single emitter. You know when I said this tutorial is going to be quote unquote exciting? Now you can see why I'm, this is why I gave the precursor, but yeah, basically this particle is going to be instanced on every one of these, placeholder particles, which means, here's the point. If we were to make a material and change the color for the sphere, so let's change it to red or something, it changes it for all of these. But now the question is, that's fine. We want to do that. But how do we change the color, not for every single particle, but each one a different color? Well, to do that, there's a useful node. Again, make sure we're in the sphere, because this is the instanced object. We are gonna, that is a word, my God. We are gonna load in the particle info node. This is a node that nobody talks about. It's kind of risque. I'm expecting that to change in 30 to 40 to 50 years when the political climate changes and we can talk about particle info node publicly. This node, what it does is it actually stores information about each particle. If we actually go through these, you're going to see that it's not really working, and that's because of an age-old problem that I hope will be fixed eventually, that Eevee doesn't store this information. Cycles does, though. You can see when we look at cycles, we can see the age, so most of these are white, but the particles that are just spawned at the finger, they're closer to black because their age is closer to like 0 frames, right? All of these have a bigger kind of thing. We can also look at, we can also look at random, so each one of these could have a slightly random color. We have age, we have lifetime. Lifetime is just the, what is it? It is output. I'm trying to find the emitter. Lifetime is basically how long the particle is going to be alive. It's this number minus that number because, when does it spawn? When does it despawn? Obviously. Let's go back to this. Location, other stuff like that. None of this is important. The point is we want to color these based on how old the particle is. So, of course, we want age, again, telling us how old the particle is, but we somehow need to normalize this so it's not like starting at 0 and then after 1 frame, everything is, equal to white. So to do this, we want the oldest, absolutely the oldest particles to have a value of 1, and the youngest particles to have a value of 0. In other words, we just divide by the lifetime, right? That is the normalization step. If you don't know why that works, and let me show you, first of all, that it does work. You can see now it's very normalized. We can actually see the shades of gray going from dark to brighter as the particles get older. If you don't understand why it's working, rather, again, the age is going from 0 frames all the way to like 200 something, which is bigger than 1. So all of it's white. We divide by this and it works out, right? That's the point. We take this and now we kind of have a mask that we could take 2 colors with a mix RGB and mix them together with a factor. So let's have one of them be red, one of them be, purple. Let's make both of those colors brighter. You can see that this is now the factor that mixes these together. So the older the particle is, the closer it gets to purple. And maybe purple should be like blue or something like that. Okay, cool. We can take this. Let's send it through a principled BSDF so it's not just like raw color, but it actually has shading data. So let's do principled BSDF, and I'm not going to worry too much about lighting or anything like that. We're just going to keep the light from the beginning. Let's make sure we can view that. Now you can see these look a lot more 3D. So again, you can move the light to get different shadows. I'm not too worried about it. What I'm worried about is just getting these to be a bit brighter. So let's also hook this up to emission, just so it has still some of that 3D-ness to it. You can see there's a bit of specular, a bit of shadow, but there's also a bit of brightness going on. Another thing is, I guess we can mess with the alpha, in other words, how transparent it is. But the way we want to do it is the further away, or in other words, like in terms of gravity, further away from the emitter, or in other words, the older the particle is, the more time gravity has had to affect on it. We want that to make it more transparent. So we hook this up. Of course, this is going to be the inverse because alpha is going to be very close to 0 because age is 0 in the beginning, and then it gets brighter and brighter and brighter. Point is, we want to take this, and I'm going to invert this. So now the alpha goes closer to 0 as we go away, so it gets more and more transparent. And then a final thing just to add, and this kind of gives it a bit of depth and dimension, and the particles are fading and stuff like that. Final thing, just to give it a bit of extra oomph, is you can see the footage kind of intentionally. If we hide the emitter, you can see the fingers like not that well in focus because I'm bad at filming, but you can see this is kind of in focus, and the body, in other words, me. This is me, by the way, wearing my protective face mask. I have a cooler one. Whoops, I have a cooler one, but not for this tutorial. What was the point? The point was I'm out of focus, whereas the finger's in focus, so we could add a bit of depth of field to the particles as well. Quick way to do that is for the camera. We are going to enable depth of field. We want the depth of field to be kind of like in focus. The focal plane should be on the ground plane, because that's where the emitter is going to be, on that focal plane. So I'm just going to add in another empty. This is going to be our empty for pulling focus. Long story short, go to your camera, depth of field enabled. Where is it? Depth of field enabled, focus object, the new empty, which I guess is just called empty, and then bring down your f-stop. Wow, I really choked down that word, f-stop. And the lower we make it, the bigger the bokeh balls are going to be. Let's try 0.2. That is a bit ridiculous. Let's try 0.5, a little less ridiculous. And you just kind of want to play around with this number. And you can see the way this is working is particles on the focal plane, on the ground plane, are going to be in focus near the finger, and then otherwise slightly out of focus. And if you want to be more technically correct, I guess we want to take this empty and just like raise it a tiny bit because the finger's a tiny bit out of focus. I guess those particles should be just a tiny bit out of focus. But that's if we're being technical. Let's try render, F12. Now it's going to render a bit more slowly, mostly because of the depth of field and the alpha, but you can see we still have the transparency, and now it's emissive and has some 3D-ness to it. Let's see what we got. Okay, it's rendering, and then it's putting the stuff in the background. Not bad at all. If you want to make this look a bit better, play around with the emission, play around with the colors, the particle system, and stuff like that. But just a quick trick to make it look more like, I don't know, mystical, add in a glare node for, again, the particle node, so that the glare is only going to affect the particle pass. What we want to do is set this to fog glow, bring down the threshold, and there you go. You can see like a very, very faint, barely there. By the way, we weren't on GPU, that's why I was rendering so slowly. But you can see a barely present glare. Another way to do this that's kind of like a bit better in this case is we could do a blur, and this is gonna be kind of like a glare. We take this, we bring it up just so it blurs out our particles a bit, and you can think of this as a glow. We take this, we take it, we do an alpha over with our original particles on top. So now we have the particles with a bit of blurry glow. Use this as the alpha over here. I just kind of put an intermediary step. And now you can see these are glowing. If we set this to 0, it's going to be, wait for it, less glow. If we set it to 100, it's going to be, wait for it, a lot of glow. And again, the thing about this is whatever frame we go to update the particles, we need to re-F12. Wow, my voice is really going. Remember how I said this is the last thing before I'm going to sleep? Guess I must have talked a lot today. But yeah, I guess I didn't even add glow in the original render, but maybe I'll update that by the time you see it. Yeah, I think that's the essence of the tutorial. We went through particles, tracking, compositing, cycles, I don't know. We did the whole shebang. If you want this to now like render, you're going to need to render every single frame, not just one. So, you go to render animation, Control F12, and you can do that. But in general, that is the tutorial. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something about how to at least integrate all these processes together if you didn't know. I mean, maybe you already knew how to do tracking and all this, but now you know how to combine all these ideas together in a very simple project. I'm thinking about building off of this in a second tutorial, just doing a different effect that kind of uses the same footage. We'll see. Either way, we've made it to the end, and I want to thank all the patrons because they are the ones that make it possible for me to make tutorials. They fund it. And of course, I like to talk about the Patreon in the end. This is the place. By the way, why would you want to be a patron? This is the point of this. The reason is you can get exclusive tutorials there that I upload occasionally. Those tend to be much longer tutorials I do not post on this channel or the CG Matter channel. You could get those there. You could get the blend file, for example. This project, I'm going to make a blend file so you could actually play around with it. You get access to early access sometimes, definitely behind the scenes content, Discord servers, stuff like that. But in general, I appreciate all 560. It's a big number of the patrons, which is why it takes so long to scroll through all the names. So I like to give you guys credit. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope you learned something. I'm sorry I lost my voice near the end, but I kept the microphone close to my mouth. So just should sound like my voice is deeper than it really is. And in reality, I'm a little pipsqueak, right? But in here, this is my domain, and I can have whatever depth of voice that I want. That's it. That's the show. I'm rambling at this point. Hope you enjoyed. See ya.